Polls show that inflation is by far the #1 issue on Americans' minds. So what have our elected representatives been doing to stem the tide of rising prices? Mostly pointing the finger at each other, trying to completely avoid responsibility for the problem. Of course, most members of Congress are millionaires, so it's not like rising prices are keeping them up at night. But for the rest of us, the increasing cost of living is stretching our wages thinner and thinner. To get an idea of the crisis most Americans are facing, we spoke to Shailly Barnes, policy director at the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Can you just generally define what inflation means, and how does it affect the average American?
Yeah, so inflation is basically the loss of purchasing power over time. So basically your money isn't going to go as far today as it did yesterday, or tomorrow as it did today. And what's so scary about it, when you see households that are already struggling to meet basic needs, now seeing the cost of food, the cost of utilities, the cost of gas go up, it means that there's less money for rent, for medications, for healthcare, for childcare. And this is especially hard as the economic supports that were present during the pandemic period, like expanded unemployment, like the moratorium on evictions, like the expanded child tax credit, these have all now expired. And so we're hearing actually a lot of stories about people going back to having to make these hard decisions between what bills to pay, whose needs are kind of fully met and whose are compromised, and paying rent using your credit card, this kind of thing.
So there's this idea that's being presented in the media right now that inflation is this distraction issue, or that it's being exaggerated by the Republicans to make the Biden administration look bad. But polling data clearly shows that this is the #1 issue on most Americans' minds, way ahead of COVID or Ukraine. So do you think there's some kind of disconnect between the administration and average people in this country? And what do you think explains that?
We see this across party lines, that the COVID-19 stimulus package pumped too much money into the economy, and it increased the demand for goods beyond the capacity of the supply that existed. And this is what's leading to the increase in prices. And so, Republicans are using this argument to push back against further spending that would, help these households, spending on programs like the child tax credit and other things. But we're also seeing it, among Democrats, and not just the Joe Manchins and other Democrats that we might expect to be kind of against this, increased spending. Jason Furman, who used to lead the Council of Economic Advisors, says that we can't provide any more direct cash relief. Others are saying, especially to households, others are saying that, the best chance of a decline in inflation is actually a new COVID variant. These are pretty dire predictions of what we need, or assessments of what we need, and they're based on, again, this narrative that is rooted in fact in an assessment of the economy that says that the wealthy and those with wealth and influence are drivers of the economy, and if they do well, we all do well, right? And so on the flip side of this is that the poor, or people who are struggling, are a drag on the economy. They want more than they deserve. They got a hand up, but they got, for a moment during the pandemic, now they're on their own and they got to sort this stuff out. And it actually ignores the trillions of dollars that went into financial institutions. It ignores the hundreds of billions of dollars that went into the military, the distortionary effects that spending has had and will have on our economy. And so this is the framework that we're dealing with that, again, spans party lines. And what it minimizes is, in fact, what is the cause of this inflationary crisis, which is the pandemic. We had to shift out of necessity away from face-to-face interactions during the lockdown. That shifted our spending away from services towards goods. It in fact accelerated e-commerce spending, our spending online, 4 to 6 years faster than we were predicted to go. And so, this reallocation of how we spend our money carried over past, the worst, into 2021. And alongside this reallocation of spending, there were these supply chain breaks. And if we were clear that this was the cause of this inflationary crisis, or at least one of the main drivers of it, then I think our policy and political response would be different. We wouldn't be talking about cutting programs or not spending on households that actually need additional help right now. We might actually be talking about how to benefit these households so they can withstand this inflationary crisis and these pressures that they're feeling. We might talk about the inflated prices of assets like stocks and bonds and financial instruments. We might talk about how those inflated assets are increasing the costs of water, of grains, of housing, and driving up the costs of our basic needs. And we might redefine, patriotism away from, a militarized idea of patriotism and war and violence, but more about what we're willing to do as a nation with the abundance that we have to live into our constitutional moral values, to provide for the general welfare, to ensure, and to establish justice rather than allowing for 40% of the country or more to be, really, poor, one emergency away from being poor and living on the edge of constant crisis right now.
So the Poor People's Campaign is one of the leading organizations talking about poverty in this country. You just mentioned the statistic that 40% of this country, or 140 million people, are one paycheck away from total financial ruin. And you don't hear a lot of talk about poverty in the media or among politicians, certainly not reflective of the scale of the crisis that you're describing. So can you talk about just how deep this crisis is and why isn't it talked about more widely?
So if I might take us back just for a minute about how we arrived at this figure, the 140 million, what we did was we took the current poverty measure and we doubled the threshold, because the current threshold is something like, at the time we figured this out, $15,000 or something like that for a single individual, $20-some thousand for a family of four, which is far too low and has been far too low for decades. This is, everyone agrees that the poverty measure is too low. So we doubled it to include, everyone who's living below that threshold and everyone who's living right above it, so that one emergency away standard. And that's when we saw that, in addition to the 40 million people who were at or below the poverty line, there's another 95 to 100 million people who are living right above it. And through the course of a year, you can dip above and below that line, right? And so this is how we arrive at the 140 million. And this includes, more than half of our children. The racial disparities are very clear in these numbers. It's 60% of Black non-Hispanic people, or about 26 million Black folks. It's 64% or 38 million Hispanic folks. It's 40% of Asian people, that's about 8 million people, almost 60% of Native and Indigenous people, or about 2 million. But then when we look at the numbers, it's also 1/3 or 66 million white people. And so here you can see that, the disproportionality, the effects of systemic racism, and the fact that, the greatest number of people in this country who are poor are white. And it really is in every region, every state, in fact, every county of this country has a sizable number, a sizable percent of poor people. In the latest report that we did with the Poor People's Campaign, a Poor People's Pandemic report, we looked at every county, we looked at these poverty rates across the country. And so it's 3,200 counties, over 3,000 counties. And even in the richest county, there's a poverty rate of at least 8%. And that goes, so the span is from 8% up to 94%, depending on what county we're in. So poverty is really endemic in this country. And one of the reasons we don't hear about it is because it's minimized through how we measure it. So that's one reason. But the other reason is that if we were actually to see the full extent of poverty, if we were actually able to talk about it, we'd have to look beyond kind of individual failures, right? We couldn't actually say that 140 million people were in the wrong place at the wrong time, didn't have the right values, didn't work hard enough, or needed to pray more, right? We couldn't actually blame individual behaviors for what is clearly a systemic failure. We'd have to turn our gaze to what are the policies and systems that created this condition of widespread poverty and economic security, and what are the policies and systems that perpetuate and deepen it. And we wouldn't be able to kind of, so it would compel this greater look, closer look at these policies that have been accumulating not just over one or two administrations, but really for decades. And as King said more than 50 years ago, The means exist, and this was in 1968, the means exist to lift the load of poverty, but for at least, these past 50 years, we have not done so.